I'll wait till people get in here to show them my hair. It's not how it's going to be all the time. And hit record. Try this out. We're going to read Anne of Green Gables because, oh my gosh, you're in on the ground floor, Tate and Andrew. Okay, first things first. I'm wanting to record this, so that's what I'm gonna do. We're gonna record it. Hopefully the sound works out on this thing because I have like a clip-on microphone, but it has one of those jack things, and with my computer, like, whatever, you don't need to know the details, but I got my hair cut Saturday, and the lady, I said, I want curtain bangs and I want highlights, and I really love the color. I'll show you the back of it. I'm loving the color. The curtain bangs, not so much. I feel like she could have done a better job, like, evening them out. And then also she said, get a flat iron and curl it. But the thing is, guys, I've never used a flat iron before to curl my hair. Never used a flat iron, period. So I tried it this morning. And there's a learning curve, and I think I want to go back to like just a regular curling iron or rollers or something. But more importantly, get to these flowers. Who thought that these like snowball bush flowers would go with these grocery store roses so well? This makes me so happy. Oh, it's so pretty. It doesn't smell, but hey. Around the outside of, oh my god, around the outside of a curling iron, hold it with my finger and hold it with your fingers. Yeah, I tried that. So obviously I'm gonna have to learn how to edit sound because that was really loud. My water bottle falling off. Makes more of a natural shape. Yeah, there's a learning curve. There's definitely a learning curve with the flat iron, and I guess I'm glad I have one now, but Lalo, I have new hair. And when I got when I got home from the hairdresser, Ayla said this looks gray because it's so blonde. Whatever. I like it. I like it. But all of this was curled like 10 minutes ago, and it just fell out because my hair doesn't really keep a curl. So if I have to curl my hair in order for it to look good, it's just not going to look good. I'm just going to walk around with ugly hair. Funky colors for the highlights. Yeah, like rainbow, like different colors. That'd be fun. All right. What did you guys do this weekend? The reason I picked this this book, number one, I love it so much. I love Anne of Green Gables so much. So much. And I haven't, for whatever reason, have not read it on my live streams yet. I don't know how. I don't know why. And the copy that I have, that I got Ayla, actually, it's hers. It's not mine. It's from Rifle Paper Company. The illustration on the front. Isn't it the most adorable book? No, the author is Canadian, from Prince Edward Island, and it's like a dream of mine to go to Prince Edward Island and go visit the house. They had a series on Netflix recently. You folded a name into one? What do you mean folded a name into one? Oh, the book folding. Oh, isn't it just the cutest? Look at the back. Look at the flowers. Like, just having this on your shelf, on my shelf, it just makes me happy. Last year, when the pandemic broke out, Ayla and I read a chapter every night, and it was the most, for like a month, and it was the most like comforting thing I think we could have done during that time. It would just, it's just such a feel good book anyway. Um, it was just amazing, and if I can just impart even a little bit of the feel good vibes from the book to you guys by reading it, then I'll be so happy. But there is a series on Netflix called Anne with an E, and if you haven't watched it, I highly recommend it. Recommend watching it. Beautiful, just beautifully done, and you can read the book over and over again. And there's some production series, movies, miniseries, whatever, this story has been done over and over and over again. And a lot of times people want to stick with the text, as closely as possible. Anne with an E did a wonderful job of reimagining the story, and they added characters that weren't in the book and scenarios that weren't in the book. And I feel like collectively people who loved the book also loved the series, and it's rare. It's rare when something like that happens, like when you change the story a bit and everyone still loves it just as much, if not more. There was a series or a movie that came out in the 80s when I was little, and I can't remember the name of the actress, but was it Katharine Hepburn, who was the who played Marilla O'Brien or what's her name? Anyway, someone will comment maybe that knows. And I always felt like that was my Anne. That was my Anne Shirley, that whole movie. But then when Anne with an E came out, I was like, oh my gosh, this one might be mine forevermore. Anyway, if you love the book, you really love the book. And Tate, I'm so glad that you love it. There's not much this doesn't need much of a preamble. I'm just going to get right into it and start reading it. And I hope that you enjoy it. I think I'm going to read it a chapter at a time. And to set it up, if you haven't heard, Anne Shirley is an orphan. And she, just to set it up, there's a mix-up. She's not actually supposed to go to Prince Edward Island. And the quote at the beginning of this is, "The good stars met." This was 1909, I think? 1908. First published 1908. Timeless, and some parts are so modern still. I hope you fall in love with Anne. Like I have. Anne, you end up falling in love with Anne, in love with Matthew, in love with Marilla, in love with the town people, and the place even. Okay, the good stars met in your horoscope, made you of spirit and fire and dew. All right, chapter 1. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is surprised. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea main road dipped down into a little hollow, fringed with alders and ladies' eardrops, and traversed by a brook that had its source away back in the woods of the old Cuthbert place. It was reputed to be an intricate, headlong brook in its earlier course through those woods, with dark secrets of pool and cascade, but by the time it reached Lynn's Hollow, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream, for not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum. It was probably conscious that Mrs. Rachel was sitting at her window, keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed, from brooks and children up, and that if she noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof. There are plenty of people in Avonlea and out of it who can attend closely to their neighbors' business by dint of neglecting their own, but Mrs. Rachel Lynde was one of those capable creatures who can manage their own concerns and those of other folks into the bargain. She's nosy. She's nosy. She was a notable housewife. Her work was always done and well done. She ran the sewing circle, helped run the Sunday school, and was the strongest prop of the Church Aid Society and Foreign Missions Auxiliary. Yet, with all this, Mrs. Rachel found abundant time to sit for hours at her kitchen window, knitting cotton warp quilts. She had knitted 16 of them, as Avonlea housekeepers were wont to tell in odd voices, and keeping a sharp eye on the main road that crossed the hollow and wound up the steep red hill beyond. Since Avonlea occupied a little triangular peninsula jutting out of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, with water on two sides of it, anybody who went out of it or into it had to pass over that hill and run to the unseen gauntlet of Mrs. Rachel's all-seeing eye. She was sitting there one afternoon in early June. The sun was coming in at the window warm and bright. The orchard on the slope below the house was in a bridal flush of pinky white bloom, hummed over by a myriad of bees. Thomas Lynde, a meek little man whom Avonlea people called Rachel Lynde's husband, was sowing his late turnip seed on the hill field beyond the barn, and Matthew Cuthbert ought to have been sowing his on the big red brook field away over by Green Gables. Mrs. Rachel knew he ought because she had heard him tell Peter Morrison the evening before in William J. Blair's store over at Carmody that he meant to sow his turnip seed the next afternoon. Peter had asked him, of course, for Matthew Cuthbert had never been known to volunteer information about anything in his whole life. And yet here was Matthew Cuthbert, at 3:30 on the afternoon of a busy day, placidly driving over the hollow and up the hill. Moreover, he wore a white collar and his best suit of clothes, which was plain proof he was going out of Avonlea, and he had the buggy and the sorrel mare, which betokened that he was going a considerable distance. Now, where was Matthew Cuthbert going, and why was he going there? Hi, Malik. Oh my gosh, she's so nosy. I just love that the book starts with her because it's just so curious. Like all of this information that maybe another person wouldn't think twice about, but a nosy busybody, it goes through all of like these things that just don't add up in her mind. Had it been any other man in Avonlea, Mrs. Rachel, deftly putting this and that together, might have given a pretty good guess as to both questions, but Matthew so rarely went from home that it must be something pressing and unusual which was taking him. He was the shyest man alive and hated to go among strangers or to any place where he might have to talk. Matthew, dressed up with a white collar and driving in a buggy, was something that didn't happen often. Mrs. Rachel, ponder as she might, could make nothing of it, and her afternoon's enjoyment was spoiled. You've come in just at the beginning. I'll just step over to Green Gables after tea and find out from Marilla where he's gone and why, the worthy woman finally concluded. He doesn't generally go to town this time of year, and he never visits. If he'd run out of turnip seed, he wouldn't dress up and take the buggy to go for more. He wasn't driving fast enough to be going for a doctor, yet something must have happened since last night to start him off. I'm clean puzzled, that's what, and I won't know a minute's peace of mind or conscience until I know what has taken Matthew Cuthbert out of Avonlea today. Accordingly, after tea, Mrs. Rachel set out. She had not far to go. The big, rambling, orchard-embowered house where the Cuthberts lived was a scant quarter of a mile up the road from Lynn's Hollow. To be sure, the long lane made it a good deal farther. Matthew Cuthbert's father, as shy and silent as his son after him, had got as far away as he possibly could from his fellow men without actually retreating into the woods where he founded his homestead. Green Gables was built at the farthest edge of his cleared land, and there it was to this day, barely visible from the main road along which all the other Avonlea houses were so sociably situated. Mrs. Rachel Lynde did not call living in such a place living at all. It's just staying, that's what she said, as she stepped along the deep-rutted grassy lane bordered with wild rose bushes. It's no wonder Matthew and Marilla are both a little odd, living away back here by themselves. Trees aren't much company, though dear knows, if they were, there'd be enough of them. I'd rather look at people. To be sure, they seemed contented enough, but then I suppose they're used to it. A body can get used to anything, even to being hanged, as the Irishman said. With this, Mrs. Rachel stepped out of the lane into the backyard of Green Gables. Very green and neat and precise was the yard, set about on one side with great patriarchal willows, and the other side with prim Lombardies. Not a stray stick nor stone was to be seen, for Mrs. Rachel would have seen it if there had been. Privately, she was of the opinion that Marilla Cuthbert swept that yard as often as she swept her house. One could have eaten a meal off the ground without overbrimming the proverbial peck of dirt. Mrs. Rachel rapped smartly at the kitchen door and stepped in when bidden to do so. The kitchen at Green Gables was a cheerful apartment, or would have been cheerful if it had not been so painfully clean as to give it something of the appearance of an unused parlor. Its windows looked east and west. Through the west one, looking out on the backyard, came a flood of mellow June sunlight. But the east one, whence you got a glimpse of the bloom-white cherry trees in the left orchard and nodding slender birches down in the hollow by the brook, was greened over by a tangle of vines. Here sat Marilla Cuthbert when she sat at all, always slightly distrustful of sunshine, which seemed to her too dancing and irresponsible a thing for a world which was meant to be taken seriously. And here she sat now, knitting at the table behind her, and at the table behind her was laid for supper. What do you think of Mrs. Rachel Lynde and Marilla so far? I think they're pretty serious people, right? Mrs. Rachel, before she had fairly closed the door, had taken mental note of everything that was on the table. There were 3 plates laid, so that Marilla must be expecting someone home with Matthew to tea, but the dishes were everyday dishes, and there was only crabapple preserves and one-of-a-kind cake, so that the expected company could not be any particular company. Yet what of Matthew's white collar and the sorrel mare? Mrs. Rachel was getting fairly dizzy with this unusual mystery about quiet, unmysterious Green Gables. Good evening, Rachel, Marilla said briskly. This is a real fine evening, isn't it? Won't you sit down? How are all your folks? Something that, for lack of any other name, might be called friendship existed and always had existed between Marilla Cuthbert and Mrs. Rachel, in spite of, or perhaps because of, their dissimilarity. Marilla was a tall, thin woman with angles and without curves. Her dark hair showed some gray streaks and was always twisted up in a hard little knot behind, with 2 wired hairpins stuck aggressively through it. She looked like a woman of narrow experience and rigid conscience, which she was, but there was a saving something about her mouth, which, if it had been ever so slightly developed, might have been considered indicative of a sense of humor. We're all pretty well, said Mrs. Rachel. I was kind of afraid you weren't, though. When I saw Matthew starting off today, I thought maybe he's going to the doctor's. Marilla's lips twitched understandingly. She had expected Mrs. Rachel up. She had known that the sight of Matthew jaunting off so unaccountably would be too much for her neighbor's curiosity. "Oh, no, I'm quite well, although I had a bad headache yesterday," she said. "Matthew went to Bright River. We're getting a little boy from an orphan asylum in Nova Scotia, and he's coming on the train tonight." If Marilla had said that Matthew had gone to Bright River to meet a kangaroo from Australia, Mrs. Rachel could not have been more astonished. She was actually stricken dumb for 5 seconds. It was unsupposable that Marilla was making fun of her, but Mrs. Rachel was almost forced to suppose it. "Are you in earnest, Marilla?" she demanded when voice returned to her. "Yes, of course," said Marilla, as if getting boys from orphan asylums in Nova Scotia were part of the usual spring work on any well-regulated Avonlea farm, instead of being an unheard of innovation. Mrs. Rachel felt she had received a severe mental jolt. She thought in exclamation points. A boy, Marilla, and Matthew Cuthbert, of all people, adopting a boy from an orphan asylum. Well, the world was certainly turning upside down. She would be surprised at nothing after this. Nothing. "What on earth put such a notion into your head?" she demanded disapprovingly. This had been done without her advice being asked, and must perforce be disapproved. "Well, we've been thinking about it for some time, all winter, in fact," returned Marilla. "Mrs. Alexander Spencer was up here one day before Christmas, and she said she was going to get a little girl from the asylum over in Hopetown in the spring. Her cousin lives there, and Mrs. Spencer has visited her and knows all about it. So Matthew and I have talked it over and on ever since. We thought we'd get a boy. Matthew's getting up in years, you know. He's 60, and he isn't so spry as he once was. His heart troubles him a good deal, and you know how desperate hard it's got to be to get hired help. There's never anybody to be but those stupid, half-grown little French boys, and as soon as you do get one broke into your ways and taught something, he's up and off to the lobster canneries or the States. At first, Matthew suggested getting a homeboy, but I said no, flat to that. They may be all right, and I'm not saying they're not, but no London street herbs for me, I said. Give me a native born at least. Okay, this is also an example of how Dr. X, how close-minded everyone in Avonlea is very extremely close-minded. There'll be a risk. I mean, you almost have to be. This is the turn of the 20th century, and they live basically on an island. And yeah, they're all very close-minded. There'll be a risk no matter who we get, but I'll feel easier in my mind and sleep sounder at nights if we get a born Canadian. So in the end, we decided to ask Mrs. Spencer to pick us out one when she went over to get her little girl. We heard last week she was going. Yeah, I got my hair done. And I'm glad you think it's blonde instead of gray, like Ayla. And I got a bunch of it cut off too. So it feels lighter and floofier now. My summer look, I guess. Where was I? We heard last week. You think I was trying to do something with it, and I have to figure out something else that works better than the method I used this morning. Where was I? This is going to be an awful podcast. Thank you so much to listen to. But that's okay. Even awful podcasts deserve airtime, right? Okay. Dr. X and Malik, and I know Andrew hasn't read it because I asked him before and he said no. Tate said Tate has read it. Have you guys read Anne of Green Gables before? Or watched the the series on Netflix. We're almost done with this chapter. We haven't really got to the exciting part, but really every chapter there's some kind of oh, you haven't read it. Okay, there's some drama every chapter. There's some like it's a real page turner. Like what could possibly happen on this tiny little island town in Canada, with a bunch of like older people. What could possibly happen except a whole bunch of stuff. um okay. So in the end, we decided to ask. Oh, good. We decided to ask Mrs. Spencer to pick us out one when she went over to get her little girl. We heard last week she was going, so we sent her word by Richard Spencer's folks at Carmody to bring us a smart, likely boy of about 10 or 11. We decided that would be the best age, old enough to be of some use in doing chores right off, and young enough to be trained up proper. We mean to give him a good home and schooling. We had a telegram from Mrs. Alexander Spencer today. The mailman brought it from the station saying they were coming on the 5:30 train tonight, so Matthew went to Bright River to meet him. Mrs. Spencer will drop him off there. Of course she goes on to White Sands Station herself. Can you imagine? This is how people communicated on this island. A telegram was sent from the orphanage to the post office. The mailman carried the telegram to the house, and that's how they knew to leave to get this child from the station that evening. So Matthew went to Bright River to meet him. Mrs. Spencer will drop him off there. Of course, she goes on to White Sands Station herself. Mrs. Rachel prided herself on always speaking her mind. She proceeded to speak it now, having adjusted her mental attitude to this amazing piece of news. Well, Marilla, I'll just tell you plain that I think you're doing a mighty foolish thing. A risky thing, that's what. You don't know what you're getting. You're bringing a strange child into your house and home, and you don't know a single thing about him. Not what his disposition is like, nor what sort of parents he's had, nor how he's likely to turn out. Yeah, for real. Why, it was only last week I read in the paper how a man and his wife up west on the island took a boy out of an orphan asylum, and he set fire to the house at night. Set it on purpose, Marilla, and nearly burnt them to a crisp in their beds. And I know another case where an adopted boy used to suck the eggs. They couldn't break him of it. If you had asked my advice in the matter, which you didn't do, Marilla, I'd have said, for mercy's sake, not to think of such a thing, that's what. This Job's comforting seemed neither to offend nor alarm Marilla. She knitted steadily on. And this is such a insight into Marilla's personality. She's very like unflappable. She's closed-minded, but unflappable. I don't deny there's something in what you say, Rachel. I've had some qualms myself, but Matthew was terrible set on it. I could see that, so I gave in. It's so seldom Matthew sets his mind on anything that when he does, I always feel it's my duty to give in. As for the risk, there's risks in pretty... Oh, please do. Please do. Sorry about that, guys, that comment. It's so seldom. I'm sorry, but Matthew was terrible set on it. I could see that, so I gave in. It's so seldom Matthew sets his mind on anything that when he does, I always feel it's my duty to give in. And as for the risk, there's risks in pretty near everything a body does in this world. There's risks in people having children of their own, if it comes to that. They don't always turn out well. And then Nova Scotia is right close to the island. It isn't as if we're getting him from England or the States. He can't be much different from ourselves. Well, I hope it'll turn out all right, said Mrs. Rachel in a tone that plainly indicated her painful doubts. Only don't say I didn't warn you if he burns Green Gables down or puts strychnine in the well. I heard of a case over in New Brunswick where an orphan asylum child did that, and the whole family died in fearful agonies. Only it was a girl in that instance. Well, we're not getting a girl, said Marilla, as if poisoning wells was a purely feminine accomplishment and not to be dreaded in the case of a boy. I'd never dream of taking a girl to bring up. I wonder at Mrs. Alexander Spencer for doing it. But there she wouldn't shrink from adopting a whole orphan asylum if she took it into her head. Mrs. Rachel would have liked to stay until Matthew came home with his imported orphan, but reflecting it would be a good 2 hours at least before his arrival, she concluded to go up the road to Robert's Bell and tell them the news. It would certainly make a sensation, second to none, and Mrs. Rachel dearly loved to make a sensation. She took herself away, somewhat to Marilla's relief, for the latter felt her doubts and fears reviving under the influence of Mrs. Rachel's pessimism. Well, of all things that ever were or will be, ejaculated Mrs. Rachel when she was safely out in the lane, it does really seem as if I must be dreaming. Well, I'm sorry for that poor young one, and no mistake. Matthew and Marilla don't know anything about children, and they'll expect him to be wiser and steadier than his own grandfather if if he's ever had a grandfather, which is doubtful. It seems uncanny to think of a child at Green Gables somehow. There's never been one there, for Matthew and Marilla were grown up when the new house was built. If they ever were children, which is hard to believe when one looks at them. I wouldn't be in that orphan's shoes for anything. But but I pity him. That's what. So said Mrs. Rachel to the wild rose bushes out of the fullness of her heart. But if she could have seen the child who was waiting patiently at the Bright River station at that very moment, her pity would have been still deeper and more profound. And that's chapter 1. Okay, if you didn't catch that clue at the end when Mrs. Rachel was talking about how she could not imagine Matthew and Marilla being children themselves, and they couldn't imagine them growing up at Green Gables. If you haven't put 2 and 2 together yet, Matthew and Marilla are actually brother and sister. They live together in this big farmhouse, and so yeah, obviously neither one of them had gotten married, and so how do you manage a big farm when you're getting up in years? It makes sense. So Matthew's 60, and I think that Marilla you're reading spoilers. I think Marilla is not that much younger than him. So they're really old enough to be the grandparents of Anne, who they think is a boy. They think Anne is a boy. So as we'll find out later, she gets into so much mischief, but the deck is stacked against her from the very beginning. I know. And obviously we know, since the book is called Anne of Green Gables, that she comes to stay there. But even though we know this, at the very beginning, there's so much tension and like what if and anxiety that at least I felt reading it. Is she gonna stay? Are they gonna accept her? So much drama. And if she does stay, like, you're hooked. Yeah. Should I read another chapter? What's I feel like the second chapter is when the story really starts. No, I don't think I'll have enough time. And I just really love it. As soon as we start hearing, oh yes, yeah, yeah, and not only is Anne an orphan girl who they didn't want a girl, um, she's redheaded, which in her mind is the worst possible thing to be. And I don't know if you, I feel like there's old, yeah, Tate, isn't there like some old like concepts that like if you're redheaded, then you're got a higher weird red. Am I still sorry? There, then I feel like there still is maybe some prejudice against redheads. I don't know. There's a ton of redheaded people in my family, and it's just by like luck that I also don't have red hair. I think I'm very Scottish, my DNA. So it's just happenstance that I don't have red hair. There's a ton of redheads in my family. You feel it. You feel the prejudice. I feel like there's still probably a lot of prejudice against redheaded people. I don't know. It's weird. You don't have souls? What? Oh my god. People are so mean and cruel. Um, and I feel like it's red having red hair is so amongst amongst I feel like having red hair is so much more common than people realize. I'll have to look it up. Um, you like redheads? I've never had like I don't know, like I guess there's too many redheaded people in my family for me to like think it's an odd thing. Um, I can't explain it. I guess people have to look down on somebody. If you're the type of person that has to look down on somebody to make yourself feel better, well, then you're gonna find something. Like how you guys have been with me long enough. Like how many people comment on my nose and make ethnic assumptions about me because of the shape of my freaking nose? Um, I mean, you're gonna find if you're that kind of person, you're gonna find things to look down on other people for. Is it human nature? Um, I don't know if it's human nature so much as the environment that you. Um, oh, they back in the Periscope days, they would say Jew, Jew. How many times? Andrew knows. As if that's some kind of insult. Like if you're calling somebody a Jew, um, like expecting some kind of response. Maybe, that's an interesting point, Dr. X. Yeah. Um, that's interesting. And they did say something about they mentioned something about Irish, something, which is yeah, like it's gotta be something. It's gotta be something. And if there's nobody, because I've lived in a town that was 300 less than 300 people, all white. And within that town, even if everybody's all white, it's you're white trash or you're trashy somehow compared to other, it's just like if that's the way that um it's not so much specific families, it's also our overall culture, right? 'Cause our culture's pretty based on the scarcity mindset, right? So if there's not enough to go around, then some people are more deserving than other people. Um, yeah, and I feel like our whole Western society culture is based on this. Being from Ireland, well, there's my family's Scottish, and they're like a ton of them are redheads. My aunt's a redhead. It's weird because my grandparents weren't redheads, but she came out like blue eyes, red hair, bright red hair. Um, and then my father didn't have red hair, and she looks totally different. Also very entitled and lots of privilege. I mean, white people? For sure, for sure. But I'm saying like even in like a rural environment where there's no um, unknown other to point the finger at, and it's just white people, like a Prince Edward Island situation where it's an island of white people, they will still find a way to demean other people and make themselves feel better about themselves. It's a thing. It could be the way you talk. It could be mostly it's how much money you have, or like what your house looks like, and some kind of hierarchical status. Um, but yeah, go redheads. And it's just by lottery that I myself is not a redhead. Yeah, yes. Oh, um, that's right. And, and Annie had it's a fault of their own. Are they orphans? To have red hair on top of being an orphan. All right, I'm gonna go because my connection is not looking great. So, but thank you guys. I guess I'm gonna keep to my oh, I have dyed my hair red before. I have had red hair before, and it was fun. I'm gonna keep to my Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule. So I'll see you on Wednesday.